Wyatt Earp is remembered as one of the greatest heroes of the Old West. In Tombstone, he is portrayed as a man who wanted nothing more than a peaceful life with his brothers, only to be dragged back into violence when criminals threatened his family. But the real story is much more complicated. The 1993 movie Tombstone turned Wyatt Earp into an almost legendary figure, and many of the details audiences remember as history were actually changed, simplified, or completely invented. The more you look at the real Wyatt Earp, the harder it becomes to see him as the simple hero Hollywood created. First, Wyatt Earp did not originally come to Tombstone looking for another fight. In the movie, Wyatt and his brothers arrive with the hope of building a new life and leaving their lawman days behind. That part is surprisingly close to reality. The Earps came to Tombstone because the booming mining town offered opportunities to make money. Wyatt had already worked as a lawman in other places, but in Tombstone he initially had financial ambitions rather than a grand mission to clean up the town. The idea that Wyatt was simply a retired hero who wanted peace is where the movie begins turning reality into mythology. Second, Wyatt was not actually the official lawman in Tombstone in the way the movie makes him appear. His brother Virgil was the city marshal, and Wyatt served as a deputy under him. Wyatt's role gave him authority, but his position was more complicated than the film suggests. The Earp brothers were also involved in business interests, gambling, and the political struggle inside Tombstone. Their conflict with the cowboys was not simply a battle between innocent lawmen and evil outlaws. There were competing economic and political interests behind the violence, and the line between law, business, and personal ambition was anything but clear. Third, the famous OK Corral gunfight was nowhere near as cinematic as Tombstone makes it look. The real confrontation happened on Fremont Street near the OK Corral, not inside the corral itself. The entire gunfight was over in roughly 30 seconds. 3 cowboys were killed: Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and Tom McClory. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded, Doc Holliday was grazed, and Wyatt survived without serious injury. Hollywood transformed a very short and chaotic street confrontation into one of the most dramatic gunfights in movie history. Fourth, Wyatt was not simply defending himself against men who had already decided to attack. The circumstances surrounding the gunfight were much more complicated. Ike Clanton had made threats against the Earps, but during the actual confrontation he was unarmed and escaped. The Earps were later accused of murder, and Sheriff Johnny Bean arrested them after the shooting. A preliminary hearing eventually found that the lawmen had acted within their authority, but doubts about what really happened never completely disappeared. The historical Wyatt Earp was therefore not the perfectly righteous hero the movie presents. Fifth, the movie makes Wyatt's revenge look like the inevitable result of one terrible tragedy, but the real sequence of events was more complicated. After Virgil was badly wounded and Morgan was assassinated, Wyatt and his posse went after men they believed were responsible. This became known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. The real posse did pursue and kill several men associated with the cowboys, including Curly Bill Brocious. So the movie's revenge story is based on real events. But Hollywood compressed timelines and simplified the motivations, making Wyatt look like a righteous avenger rather than a man operating in a world where revenge, law enforcement, politics, and personal survival were deeply intertwined. Sixth, one of the most famous moments in Tombstone never happened. The legendary final showdown between Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo is completely fictional. In the movie, Wyatt's enemies are systematically eliminated until Doc faces Ringo in a dramatic duel. In reality, there is no reliable evidence that Holliday ever fought Ringo in a gun duel. Ringo was found dead in July 1882 with a gunshot wound to the head, and the official conclusion was suicide, although historians have debated whether he may have been murdered. The cinematic death scene is one of the clearest examples of Tombstone turning history into myth. Seventh, even the famous image of the cowboys wearing red sashes is Hollywood's creation. The red sash look is now almost inseparable from Tombstone and has influenced countless westerns. But there is no solid historical evidence that the cowboys actually wore matching red sashes as a group. The movie created a visual language that instantly tells the audience who the villains are. It looks historically authentic, but it is essentially costume mythology. Eighth, the movie also changes Wyatt's personal life. Tombstone presents his relationship with Josephine Marcus as part of the romantic story surrounding his new life. But the real situation was much messier. Wyatt had been involved with Mattie Blaylock, while Josephine had a relationship with Sheriff Johnny Behan before becoming Wyatt's long-term partner. The film simplifies this complicated triangle and removes much of the uncomfortable reality surrounding Wyatt's relationships. The real Wyatt was not living inside the clean, heroic world the movie creates around him. Ninth, Wyatt Earp's reputation as a legendary Western hero became even bigger after his death. He did not simply leave behind an uncontested historical record. Later writers helped transform him into the iconic lawman audiences know today. One of the most influential works was Stuart N. Lake's 1931 biography, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, which presented Earp as a larger-than-life hero and simplified the conflict into a battle between Wyatt and the villains of the Old West. That version of Wyatt influenced generations of Western movies, including the image that Tombstone later perfected. And finally, perhaps the biggest secret about Wyatt Earp is that the legend was more powerful than the man himself. Tombstone gives us a hero who is calm, loyal, fearless, and forced into violence by circumstances beyond his control. The real Wyatt Earp was a far more complicated figure: lawman, gambler, businessman, saloon owner, and a man whose life became increasingly surrounded by stories that were difficult to separate from reality. That does not make Tombstone a bad movie. In fact, it is exactly why the film works so well. It took a messy chapter of American history and turned Wyatt Earp into the perfect Western hero. But once you separate the movie from the history, one thing becomes clear. Wyatt Earp was never simply the hero Hollywood wanted you to believe he was. He was a real man who lived in a violent world, made questionable decisions, survived extraordinary events, and eventually became something even more powerful than a historical figure: a legend. Another fact many people miss is that Wyatt Earp never actually became the legendary sheriff of Tombstone shown in countless westerns. His brother Virgil held the official position of city marshal, while Wyatt was serving as a deputy. The movie naturally puts Wyatt at the center because he makes the stronger hero, but historically his authority was shared with his brothers and other lawmen. Another overlooked detail is that Doc Holliday was not simply Wyatt's loyal sidekick. Their friendship was real, but their relationship was built around mutual survival in a dangerous world. Holliday was already a notorious gambler and gunfighter before Tombstone, and Wyatt's association with him made the Earp group even more controversial. The movie also makes Wyatt look almost unbeatable, but he was not. His brother Virgil was permanently injured after being ambushed, and Morgan was murdered. Wyatt himself escaped several attempts on his life, showing that the vendetta was not a clean, heroic victory. It was a brutal cycle of violence that continued long after the famous gunfight. Another major difference is what happened to Wyatt after Tombstone. The movie ends with the legend becoming almost complete, but his life continued for decades. He moved through different states and territories, worked around gambling and mining, and eventually became increasingly interested in protecting the story of his own past. The Wyatt Earp legend was still being built long after the gunfights were over. And perhaps the strangest fact of all is that Wyatt Earp never got to see Tombstone turn him into a Hollywood icon. He died in 1929, before the golden age of the Western film had fully transformed men like him into larger-than-life heroes. The version of Wyatt that millions of people know today was created decades after his death. In other words, the man disappeared, but the legend only became bigger.